down there some grassland that was located immediately adjacent to the crop field of Jeff Steffens. This is long-term no-till right here. Jeff, do you want to describe how many years it's been in this management, what crops it has had on it?
That would be about 30 years no-till, about 7 years with a more intense rotation in cover crops. So, and it's just coming off of a 5-year rotation of corn, soybeans, and then oats, soybeans, corn. I'm trying to stack the rotation more, and then, but with cover crops in the fall, or a very diverse cover crop after the spring crop. So the residue there is rye winter pea.
And so this is
of a spring crop in a 5-year rotation.
I see that the rye residue under there. I do see it. It's down in a mat, and there's a couple corn cobs here from the crop before that, which would have been corn.
That was corn. Yeah.
Yep. And I don't see any soybean stalks to speak of, which should be gone in a system like this. So then, what soil type is this?
It's Thurman sand, and it's I think you were in the Thurman or Tillo, and that is, they did an analysis of it. It's 70% sand and less than 15% clay.
Okay. And so this soil was located on a different management system, same soil type.
Same soil type.
And this is the first year this soil's been no-tilled, but then I tilled it this spring or summer right now to get it in these trays. So we've dumped this out of the 5-gallon buckets right into this tray. And then I went across the road back to some alfalfa that Jeff is establishing with the companion crop, and I stole some of the hay because I needed a little bit of residue to showcase. This is fresh tilled or bare soil, and it had corn growing on it. This is what it looked like in the field. This has 30% residue. So this would be a compliance sort of conversation where we need to have some residue management and stop some erosion. 30% residue on a Thurman sand should allow for enough infiltration and reduce soil loss to a tolerable limit in a compliance plan. It may be 50% depending on the slope. But this is like 100% no-till residue, or I'm liking it to, this has been roller crimped cover crop. So this is something where you've got an inch of residue out there from a cover crop, and it's completely covering the soil surface. And this is a really useful way to transition to no-till, to grow a cover crop that first year and then no-till into it. That allows for the roots to really do some work in that previously tilled soil, and it decreases the settling of that soil and the increase in bulk density that happens that first year. So that is a really good way to convert to no-till, is with a cover crop in place. So the pressure and the height allows that to be the same power as a raindrop coming down to the soil. Paul Yazza worked as an engineer, of course, to think about height and fall speed and pressure, and it's kind of designed, that nozzle special and the pressure reducer, it's all designed to be a raindrop impact. And so we're going to apply an inch of water here as we go along. Do you see anything missing?
No, we're good for now.
I've got my front tray covered here to prevent water from going in the funnel. I don't want the rainwater to be what's going in the funnel preferentially. I want that to only be water that runs off of the soil slice. I've got my rain gauge there in the center. You can see it filling up, and you can see what's happening to my 3 tilled soils. Those 3 tilled soils with just the only change I made was the amount of cover. And then on the end, the far end, is that grassland and that long-term no-till. So we're just about to an inch of water. Oh, we're at 1.5 inches. I'm watching the wrong line. That's good. We'll put 1.5 inches on. And we'll shut this thing down. So we're going to let all the water kind of drain out of this. By putting just 1.5 inches on, we don't get to extreme things. We're not We're not looking for an extreme rain event here, like a 10-inch rain, or last night they got 6 inches in Murdoch, there east of Lincoln. That was a little bit of a strain on the systems. 2015, I worked in Hebron, Nebraska at the NRCS office down there, and we got a 15-inch rain that night, in one night in May. It did 40 years worth of damage in one night. You know, roads blowing out and dams blowing out, everything that you could think of. I went out to a no-till field that had a cover crop in the waterway, and that cover crop had just laid down, and it actually gained some soil from the neighbors. It drained two whole pivots. One was tilled, one wasn't, and it gained soil. And the next door neighbor, his whole waterway is blown out, 40 feet wide, 20 feet deep, just a mess. The power of cover crop as a tool is really only tested through extreme weather events, like a drought, like an extreme rain, flooding, or when you need to bail out your cattle. Or the value of cover crop can come out of nowhere just by having it as an option. So it's a multi-use tool. So when we start to look at some of this, you can take these trays off. And I do like to just set these down. These are the runoff jars. This one from the grass and the no-till. The no-till has that little bit in it, just like the last no-till sample. That's all right. It's got a little disturbance in the system. So the runoff from the 0 residue and the runoff from the 30% residue. You can see how much just that little smattering of residue can really make a difference. And I should put those out just a little bit so we can talk about the infiltration jars next. This is the 100% residue. So that's the difference between having a big old cover crop residue and having just a little bit of corn or bean residue left over on a tilled soil. So we'll take these off. And I'll just start with this one. Oh, I guess I'll talk about these jars first. So the aquifer, you know, water infiltration is a funny thing. Our mind thinks, oh, well, where's that water going? Well, we only have 2 inches of soil here. So that water is going to the soil that's below it. And how far? Well, how far is it to water? How deep's your well? That's how far the water can go before we're going to actually put that in the aquifer. So the soil profile is an amazing water storage tank. It just soaks that water in, and then it gives it back to a plant root. So I'm not afraid of infiltrating water through my surface soil, because you have the whole soil profile to work with. And it's a thing that when you separate the soil, it's like, whoa, where's that water coming from, or where's it going? So in this jar, there's somehow some water made it through, and it's muddy water too at that. So compare that to the long-term no-till. These are the true test. Those two fields are side by side on the same soil type, and this much water soaked into Jeff's profile, and this much water soaked into the top 2 inches of the tilled plot. This is Thurman sand, 75% sand. We should just be a sieve in our mind. Our mind says the water should just go right through that, but it doesn't. Same deal here, about the same amount in all 3 of these runoff. But there's a huge difference in these front jars. But there's no difference in the aquifer jar. So something's up here. This with 0 residue lost a lot of water. This one lost a little, and this one lost very, very little. So where'd we put all that water? When we flip this one over, it really tells me how things move through the soil. We think that rain went over the whole tray. The whole thing's wet. All the soil profile gets watered the same way. Soil doesn't work that way. It has preferential flow patterns. It's got macropores and micropores. It's got earthworm tunnels and little critter tunnels and all sorts of passageways. You never know which way the water's going as soon as it's below the surface. It could go sideways for all you know. This one soaked in all this water through this little patch of soil. That's all it took. But right here underneath of this soil, this is that grassland. Look at all this duff, all this buried residue that's in this soil layer. That must have moved that water down. This is that brome grass patch. That's really surprising. I figured that would help. So this grassland soil's got some percolation issues. I think brome grass is a bad deal. Brome grass can cause a hydrophobic soil problem. But let's look at this long-term no-till soil. That was a heavy tray. That's a lot different. The whole soil profile's got water in it. Water's everywhere. The entire top 2 inches is wet. There's an earthworm sitting here. Here's one that's here too. You know, he's still kicking. You know, when we dig through this, it's not pudding either. These are stable aggregates. This is Thurman sand. We shouldn't have a bed like that in sand, but this is black sand. This has a lot of carbon in it. A lot of water stable aggregates. So this, after 30 years of no-till and all the inputs, this is what's accomplishable. This amount of water can soak into this soil in 1.5 inches of rain. We got 1.5 inches of water. What's really interesting is this one. It's only 2 inches of soil, and it was 1.5 inches of rain. We got this much runoff and this much infiltration. I don't see any soil that's wet. So my infiltration jar, it must have got water from someplace else. Or it leaked down on the side or something. Because there's no wet soil here. There's nothing. It's just the way we put it in there. And our mind says that water should just soak into the soil. But look how much of that soil is actually wet. 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch of soil and 1.5 inches of rain. That was not a beneficial rain on that soil. Here's 30% residue. Would you think that's a good thing to have just that amount of residue left on the soil surface? Like, is that
Better than nothing.
decent?
Better than nothing.
It's better than nothing. And this is like a D's get degrees sort of concept. This is gonna barely survive. Well, it's dry too. That's the problem. But when we scoot this off, we've got quite a bit more that's wet. We got 1/2 inch of wet soil versus this 1/4 inch. This little bit that's wet here. So that little bit of residue allowed water to stay in place just that much longer and allow it to soak in at that rate, that 0.4 inches per hour rate. And that's what it took. Now, there was hardly any runoff on this one. And this is the 100% cover. And it's dry too. But if we skim this back, we might be able to just see on the side here, there's a good chunk of this that's wet. And it's all heavy. So all of that 1.5 inches went into this soil because it had 100% residue cover. And that can really make a difference. It's still 0.4 inches per hour in the soil, but it's not 0.4 inches an hour in the top inch of residue cover. It goes in and it stays put, and then it starts to wake into the soil. So these tilled soils function just the way they were supposed to. They sealed off the surface, they kept water from escaping, they kept water from entering too. And this tilled soil has a function problem, an infiltration rate problem. As soon as water stops infiltrating, it starts running off on a hill slope, and it really can make a big difference. You know, I look at the color here, the aggregate stability, and the wetness of that soil, and can see a lot of value in that.